we're going to get into some really interesting topics. I'm so pleased that we were able to receive funding from the Arts Council of Wales to put on this conversation. So huge shout outs to them. And also in advance for the 22nd, happy Windrush Day to everyone who's tuning in.
Yes,
I
sir.
hope that you have a very reflective, introspective, and appreciative time for all our elders and ancestors who created a lot of the pathways and opportunities that we enjoy today. For you as an individual growing up, do you feel like we are in a worse state than we were when you were growing up?
In a lot of ways, yes, because when I was growing up, so I was born late 70s in Hackney, um, and growing up, even though racism was far more overt, like I'm a year older than Stephen Lawrence would have been,
Right.
and in those spaces, like I knew people, I know people who were attacked, I know people who were put in hospital, I know people I was attacked, I know what that looks like, and the reality of seeing that kind of overt level of racism um, is in some ways it kind of galvanized more of a coalition mindset.
Yeah.
So, I refer to things like the youth movements in Bradford in the 1970s. I refer to the working class coalitions in East London. I refer to things like the Anti-Nazi League, these grassroots coalitions of working class communities that were, quote unquote, rainbow coalitions, but they understood what community was. They understood that community is active and dynamic. Community is not a echo chamber on social media. It's not the
Right.
five people that are around you that think exactly the same with you. I grew up in a community where people did not agree, and people didn't necessarily share the same political mindsets. They didn't. They disagreed on a lot of stuff, but they were connected and they were together in terms of collective outcomes.
Mm.
Okay, we've had 6 years of raising awareness. We've had 6 years of protest. We've had 6 years of post Black Lives Matter and the pandemic. And I can sort of make the argument that things are worse than they were 10 years ago.
I think so, yeah.
Yeah, and we're seeing very much the reality of what it means to have a far right government on both sides of the Atlantic. And that is going to be absolutely disastrous for people like us.
Mm.
I really feel like in this moment, we really need to galvanize the awareness. We need to galvanize that incredible art and design and all of the things that happen post 2020. And we need to start thinking about tangible outcomes and organizing. So
Mm.
a big part of the problem that we have as activists, as practitioners, is what we really need is to build coalition because we can't do it alone.
Yeah.
Like we just do not represent enough of a political or voting bloc to swing an election one way or the other. So it has to be a coalition. We
Yeah.
have to work together with other people, right? We can't just gatekeep everything. We have to bring people in. But in order to do that, we need those people to develop empathy and we need them to develop that in proximity. We need them to develop that in community, but actual community. But online communities are valid in terms of spreading awareness and information.
It can also be an echo chamber at times. We may think that
Very
our
much so.
community online is the representation of, the wider society, where oftentimes it isn't. And I see this a lot with elections. Sometimes I'll be seeing, on my timeline and news feed that everyone's sort of, spouting the exact same things and political beliefs that I believe in. But then you'll have an election where, a party or a side in which you may be rooting for will get absolutely battered, and you'll be thinking, how on earth has this happened? For
Absolutely.
yourself, did that empathy, did that coalition building influence a lot of your designs growing up then?
So, in terms of where I start as a designer or as an artist, it's really based on culture. Okay. So,
Right.
it's really based on me investigating culture at the time, which was hip hop culture, which was,
Mm.
um, and really trying to find ways to replicate things that I've seen from album covers and from posters
Yeah.
and from really trying to understand that visual language. And a lot of that visual language was really steeped in revolutionary thought. So I think about artists like Public Enemy, who are like a really big influence on me. So by the time I get to kind of drawing these symbols and I'm trying to understand why they have so much meaning, and I'm trying
Yeah.
to understand why they have so much power, and I'm like, I don't know what it is, but I want to make these images. I remember seeing the poster for Art Sims. Art Sims is a poster designer, African American poster designer, and he designed a poster for Spike Lee's Malcolm X. And I remember looking at the poster and just I wanted to do that. I wanted to do that thing. I wanted to do the Boys in the Hood poster. I wanted to
Yeah.
make that somehow. And I wasn't really thinking in terms of society, community, connecting. I just wanted to express that part of my culture. And you can start to advocate for yourself in all kinds of ways. Like, I would refuse to work on certain projects or certain briefs. But then eventually that needed an outlet, that needed to go somewhere. And so I started making work that was more informed by my experience as opposed to selling products, even though really we're talking about the same thing. We're talking about marketing
Yeah.
ideas, right? We're talking about connecting. So I didn't really think of it in terms of I need to connect with my community or I need to connect with my cultural identity. I was
Yeah.
feeling something that I needed to express, and the spaces that I was in wasn't conducive to that expression. So I
Right.
started doing that more and more and more. And the thing is, when we start doing work like that, it can function like as I've said many, many times, like a flag in the ground, right?
Yeah.
Because you are making a statement about how you see the world and how you perceive the world, and that brings people to you.
Right.
Okay, that gives you visibility, and now you get to align with people based on what you believe rather than what you're making. Where I'm at today, I feel like now we need to move beyond this idea of DEI being a sector and just being a niche. I think that as activists and advocates, if that's what we want, we need to move beyond this model. It's fine and it's great. If you can find work that aligns with your principles and values, that's amazing. The flip side of treating DEI and anti-racism as a space or a sector is that everything becomes transactional.
Hmm.
So every conversation becomes transactional. Every project becomes transactional. I've had so many designers refuse to, I don't know, design billboards for me because they're like, I'm not getting paid for this. If I'm not
Hmm.
getting paid, I'm not doing it. Okay,
Right.
so in that sense, you are just performing capitalism. That's all you are doing. Now, I'm not saying that people should work for free or that should exchange labor for free, but we have to be clear on what is labor and what is transformation. And if we want transformation, if we want equity, equity cannot be transactional. What equity looks like is if I am, say, a university lecturer, that education, that expertise is ring fenced around a university fee, right?
Yeah.
So in order to get that expertise, you have to pay the fee to go to university so that I can lecture you. Now, if
Hmm.
I do mentoring for free, that is equity because what I'm doing is I'm divesting that information that is ring fenced around a university fee and I'm offering it to a person of color so that they can benefit from that expertise without having to front that cost, which might not be an option for them. So that's
Right.
what equity looks like. But it's very, very difficult for me to mentor young and emerging creatives and make a ton of money doing it.
Yeah.
It's just not
I
going to
just
happen.
also want to add to that as well that I think an earlier point that you made. Firstly, I completely, sort of agree that true equity, really has to be non-transactional whatsoever. And just to also piggyback on what you were saying at the very beginning about that activism element of, the DEI sort of sector, niche that we're currently in. Do you not believe that there could be challenges in people entering this space without or calling themselves activists whilst entering this space because they have maybe an enthusiasm for social justice without the education? I refer to myself as an educator, and I know we've spoken about this as well. Sort of the difference between an activist and an educator.
As far as I'm concerned, my definition of it, activism is about policy, the law, and legislation. That is activism. If your work does not challenge any of those, then it isn't real activism. It might be advocacy, and there's a place for that. It might be solidarity, and there's a place for that. A lot of the work that I do, what I'm known for, like the artworks that I've done on billboards, I don't consider myself an activist because I am not pushing for something to change specifically that you can measure. Like, how does that affect people in their day-to-day lives? Because that's what we really need to be talking about. And this is what the right does really well. The right does a great job of appealing to working class communities and
Yeah.
playing on their concerns and their anxieties
They
in this
build
present moment.
coalitions really well. You know, they
Exactly.
do build coalitions well.
Yeah, sure.
Whilst you're looking, can I just quickly ask you a quick fire question? What has been your favorite design? Really quick, a design you've been most sort of, maybe it's the journey to actually publishing or, you know, having that design delivered. What has been your favorite design that you've done so far?
So I guess the piece of work that stands out the most is Black History Addendum. So this is the billboard that I created that says, "We did not come to Britain; Britain came to
Yes.
us," and that was inspired by an article by Adam Elliott Cooper, and the piece was really about trying to reframe that and to really understand British colonial history as the precursor to the world of immigration and
100%.
that we see today, right? If I'm thinking about it in terms of design, I have to think about my work in terms of the end user and what they
Mm.
get out of it. And it was just really, really interesting to see the discourse around it. There was a lot of pushback on the fact that I only made this billboard about the Caribbean Commonwealth and not every single nation that's been touched by
You really
British
had pushback.
colonialism.
You had pushback from
Yes, a
really?
lot.
Oh,
Yeah.
wow.
Yeah.
Wow. I'm
Yeah.
surprised.
Some people were big mad.
Wow.
Yeah,
From
yeah,
within
yeah.
our own sort of,
Yes,
you'd consider
yes.
our own sort of community, really, or a
Especially,
social space at least. Wow.
especially, yeah. People were cussing me out because
Really?
they didn't feel represented by the artwork. Rather than engaging with what the artwork represented thematically,
Yeah.
they saw it as validation. And I found that really interesting that this thing that was up in public space became
Mm.
a source of validation and I guess visibility
Mm.
rather than what this thing meant. They just saw flags and they were like, why is my flag not there?
Not there.
Why is
Yeah.
my flag, why is my history not represented in this?
Mm.
And even though the context of the piece was completely removed from the history of the, say, British colonial action on the African continent, it seemed like that didn't matter. People
Mm.
just saw, I'm not on here. And that made me realize that so much of this work is about that sense of visibility, that sense of
Mm.
appreciation, of acknowledgement. A lot of pushback from Irish people.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
And you know, I didn't realize what was happening at the time, and
Mm.
the media owners were like, well, "But it's up in Kilburn, and that's there's a lot of there's a large Irish community there," and I didn't realize.
Mm.
You know, perhaps the way forward is for to have communities be able to weigh in on something like public artworks, and this
Mm.
happens. This happens with Arts Council. This happens with a lot of
Yeah.
statues up and down the UK. Um, Thinking of things like the Kelpies and the Angel of the North. All of these things were done by public consultation, but I wonder if that can also be an informal consultation, if that can be part of community building. Because you know, when we talk about community building, it can't be this. It can't just be Instagram. It has to
Mm.
be you speaking to your neighbors, right?
Mm.
And you speaking to the people on your street or on your
Authentic.
block,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
And you may not agree with them, but it
Mm.
might be you going, hey, if there was a billboard that was up on our street and it represented us, what should it say? Now, I'm
Yeah.
not saying that art and design has to be done by committee. That's usually not a great idea, but it's more about that, what represents inclusion. Because a
Yeah.
lot of the pushback that I got from my billboard were from people who felt excluded just because there was a tiny rectangle that didn't represent their tiny rectangle.
Yeah.
So
Well,
far.
I'll wrap up with a final sort of question for you, which is for anyone that's tuned into this live stream and may not yet have the confidence to share a question, what maybe advice would you give them, particularly those who are, you know, aspirants within design and they also want to merge that design and politics? What sort of advice or encouragement would you give them? And then also, if you could, perhaps share a message in regards to Windrush and the impact and importance that
Mhm.
has to British history.
My first piece of advice would be to start local. So look around at the space that you're in. And, you know, it might be a football team. It
Mm.
might be a housing association. It might be just anything. And the thing is, when we think about protest art and protest design, we tend to focus on things like the civil rights movement in the States because they have such iconic graphic imagery. But
Yeah.
what we don't appreciate all the time is that this graphic imagery was a means to an end. It was
Mm.
about organizing people. Okay, so when people went on the Memphis sanitation workers strike, the march wasn't the point. The disruption was the point.
Yeah.
And I think sometimes when we look at art and design, we look at art and design as though that's the point. It isn't. That's just a means to something, to
Mm.
communicate something. Emory Douglas spoke about this a lot with his work, because it was very graphic and visual, and it was designed for an audience that had a low literacy rate. Okay,
Mm.
so it's really about understanding that your work is a means to something. So
Mm.
look around locally and see what you can do or how you might be of service to people in that space. And it might not be through drawing, it might not be through making art. Sometimes, even though I'm brought in as a designer or a consultant, my job is to just have a conversation, or my
Yeah.
job is to just have a discussion, right? So it's about sort of, rather than trying to push the thing that we want to do into the space, it's trying
Mm.
to understand what the space needs from us first. And this
Yeah.
is really important. We need people to buy into this idea. We need people to buy into the idea of inclusion. We need people to buy into the idea of diversity. We need those people, the kinds of
Mm.
people that are being engaged by Tommy Robinson and Reform. We need
Yeah.
them to understand that we are better together, working together. And I know
Mm.
that's uncomfortable for some people, but it isn't just about us gatekeeping this for us, right? Like Windrush is just a moment, okay? Like
Yeah.
my personal history, I am the direct descendant of a plantation owner, Hugh Mill Bunbury.
Mm.
And that was in sort of 1792. In his estate, trafficked Africans for about 3 to 4 years, with roughly 400 to 450 enslaved people a year. And he impregnated an enslaved woman who we believe might be Ghanaian, Fulani, or maybe even Nigerian.
Mm.
Um, and to add to that, Hugh Bunbury is part of one of the oldest English families
Yeah.
in
I
the
was gonna say your
country,
surname. Yeah.
right? So the origins of that name come with the Norman invasion of 1066.
Hmm.
This is to say that my history does not begin and end with Windrush. Windrush is
Yeah.
just a point in time. And so, again, Windrush is critical. It's so important in terms of expanding that history, but it's also really important in terms of fostering that connection, right?
Mm.
And really challenging what it means to be British,
Yeah.
challenging what it means to have this identity. Because, people who came over from the Caribbean around sort of 1948,
Mm.
they're part of the Commonwealth, right? They're
Yeah.
not migrants. They're not thinking of
Mm.
themselves as migrants. They're thinking this is the motherland. Britain
Yeah.
is the motherland,
But they
right?
still, for some reason, experience the same rhetoric that actual migrants are experiencing today, which is,
Yeah,
yes,
right.
yeah.
That's why the education is critical. That's why it's important in trying to reframe ideas and reframe understanding, and really, like, one of the stumbling blocks that I have in my work in terms of DEI consultancy is I will advise on campaigns and representation and visibility, who's in the campaign, who isn't, what photos being taken, who's a photographer, all of that stuff, which is great. But the buck usually stops when we come into proximity.
Okay.
Because if the people I'm speaking to just aren't around people of color, that always
Mm.
represents a gap. And that gap represents dissonance. And in that
Mm.
gap, there is opportunity for discord, there's opportunity for
Stereotype as well.
misunderstanding, for
Stereotype. Yeah.
stereotyping. And so it's so important that we create that proximity and we bring that sort of understanding, that broader understanding, to the sorts of people that we are trying to attack. Because I'm not trying to preach to the choir. I'm trying to
Yeah.
bring other people in so that we have collective solidarity to stop a somewhat inevitable reform government.
Thank you once again, Greg. Thank you all for joining.